Okay, well, it's the time that we set to start, so we'll get to it. Last time we ended at 21.15 of the section on the preface. Which, as you can see there, starts where it says, enough said. I don't know if anybody has questions or comments about the prior reading. You can make that right now on the, either voice or on the text chat on the Science of Logic channel. If not, we'll just get straight to it. All right, seems not, so we'll get on with it. So, enough said to dispel any notion that thought determinations are only for use, are only a means. More important is the related further notion that they are external forms. The activity of thought at work in us across all representations, interests, and actions is, as we have said, unconsciously busy, the natural logic. Explicit consciousness is of the content, the subject matters of representations, all the things that interest us. Taken in this relation, thought determinations are generally taken to be forms that only attach to the content, without, however, being this content itself. But if the truth of the matter is, as was already stated and is otherwise generally admitted, that the nature, the specific essence, that which is truly permanent and substantial in the manifold and accidentality of appearance and fleeting externalization, is the concept of the thing, the universal which is present in it, just as there is present in each human being, although universally unique, a specific principle that makes him human, or in each individual animal, a specific principle that makes it animal. If this is true, then there is no saying what such an individual could still be if this foundation were removed from him, no matter how many the predicates with which he would still be otherwise adorned. If, that is, such a foundation can be called a predicate like the rest. The indispensable foundation, the concept, the universal, which is thought itself, provided that with the word thought one can innermost moment of the objects, their simple life pulse, just as it is the subjective thinking of them. To bring to consciousness this logical nature that animates the spirit, that moves and works within it, this is the task. The broad distinction between instinctive act and act which is intelligent and free is that the latter is performed consciously, when the content that motivates a subject to action is drawn out of its immediate unity with the subject and is made to stand before it as an object, then it is that the freedom of spirit begins, the same spirit who, when thought is in instinctive activity, is caught up in the web of its categories and is splintered into a material of infinite variety. Here and there on this web, excuse me, here and there on this web there are knots more firmly tied than others, which give stability and direction to the life and consciousness of spirit. They owe their firmness and power simply to the fact that, having been brought before consciousness, they stand as independent concepts of its essential nature. The most important point for the nature of spirit is the relation not only of what it implicitly is in itself to what it actually is, but of what it knows itself to be to what it actually is. Because spirit is essentially consciousness, this self-knowledge is a fundamental determination of its actuality. As impulses, the categories do their work only instinctively. They are brought to consciousness one by one and so are variable and mutually confusing. Thus affording to spirit only fragmentary and uncertain actuality. To purify these categories, and in them to elevate spirit to truth and freedom, this is therefore the loftier business of logic. Okay, so that seems like a pretty straightforward big paragraph, but still pretty generally clear to me anyways. Does anyone have questions on that? Alright, seems not. So we'll continue. What we indicated as constituting the beginning of science and have just now recognized to be of great value both on its own account and as a condition of true knowledge namely the treatment of concepts and of the moments of the concept in general, of the thought determinations as forms that are at first different from the material and are only attached to it. This is a work that quickly gives itself away as being inherently inadequate for the attainment of truth, which is the object and purpose of logic. For as mere forms, as distinct from the content, such concepts and their moments are taken in a determination that stamps them as finite and makes them unfit to hold the truth which is in itself infinite. In whatever respect the true may otherwise be again associated with restriction and finitude, this aspect is the side of its negation, of its untruth and lack of actuality, even of its cessation, and not of the affirmation which, as the true, it is. Confronted by the barrenness of the merely formal categories, healthy common sense instinctively felt that it had the upper hand after all, and it contemptuously relinquished acquaintanceship with them to the domain of school logic and school metaphysics. In this, however, it underestimated the value that the consciousness of these threads already possesses by itself. It also did not perceive that when given over to the instinctive practices of natural logic, especially when all acquaintance and cognition of the thought determinations themselves had deliberately been rejected, it is in bondage to unclarified and therefore unfree thought. The simple basic determination or common form of the collection of such forms is identity, which, in the logic of this collection, is asserted as the law of identity as A equals A, and as the principle of contradiction. So much has healthy common sense lost respect for the school which still holds onto such laws of truth, and still busies itself with them, that it ridicules the school and regards as insufferable anyone who believes that in following such laws one actually says anything at all. The plant is a plant. Science is science. And so on in infinitum. Regarding the formulas that define the rules of inference, which in fact is a principal function of the understanding, however mistaken healthy common sense might be in ignoring that they have their place in cognition, where they must be obeyed, and also that they are essential material for rational thought, it has nonetheless come to the equally correct realization that such formulas are indifferently at the service just as much of error as of sophistry, and that, however truth may be defined, so far as higher truth is concerned, for instance religious truth, they are useless. That in general they have to do only with the correctness of knowledge, not its truth. The inadequacy of this way of regarding thought, which leaves truth on one side, can only be remedied by including in our consideration of thought not merely what is customarily credited to external form. I'm sorry about that noise. That's my dog deciding to chew on a bone. Testing, testing. Testing, testing. Hello, hello. Right, hello, hello, hello. Okay, I don't know what the heck happened on that. Sorry about that. How long has that been? Oh, God. Alright, let me just... There's still something off about this. Let me just see what the heck is going on. Alright. Actually, I just have that in the background just because there might have been some noise earlier. So if you hear any rain noise, that should just be a little bit. So I mainly have it on just just to drown out some noise from outside. All right, so everything's working fine now. Yes, no, hello, hello, hello.
I still don't know if you can hear me.
Oh, there you go. Now I can hear you. I don't know why this has like so many issues.
Yeah.
All right, there we go.
If everything's working, your video isn't on, but the audio should be working.
Video's not on. Oh, okay, let me see.
All right, now
Does that work? Okay.
Take two.
I'll edit that out of the stream. Because you can actually do that. All right, so where was I then? The last section?
Page 18, last paragraph. Starting with the inadequacy of this way.
Okay. All right. So the inadequacy of this way of regarding thought, which leaves truth on one side, can only be remedied by including our consideration of thought, not merely what is customarily credited to external form, but the content as well. It is soon evident that what in ordinary reflection is, as content at first separated from the form, cannot in fact be in itself formless, devoid of determination. In that case it would be a vacuity, the abstraction of the thing in itself. That it rather possesses form in it, indeed that it receives soul and substance from the form alone, that it is this form itself which is transformed into only the semblance of a content, hence also into the semblance of something external to the semblance. By thus including content into logical consideration, it is not the things, but what is rather the fact, the concept of the things, that becomes the subject matter. Just to comment on that, that little comment about soul and form is a reference towards Aristotle. In Aristotle's essay on, it's just called On the Soul, or also De Anima. Hegel calls it the greatest piece of philosophy written before Hegel himself came along. So might want to look into that. In this connection, however, one must also be reminded that there is a multitude of concepts, a multitude of facts. One way in which limits are imposed on this multitude has already been said, that the concept as thought in general, as universal, as against the particularity of the things, vaguely parading their multitudinousness before indeterminate intuition and representation, is their immeasurable abbreviation. The way I would interpret that is that the opposition of concepts as universals to particulars reduces the truth of things to these generalized universals, and their particularities completely erased. But a concept is also, first of all, in itself the concept, and this concept is only one concept, the substantial foundation. It is, of course, also a determinate concept, and it is this determinateness that appears in it as content, even though, in fact, it is a form determination of the substantial unity of the concept, a moment of the form as totality, of the concept itself, which is the foundation of the determinate concepts. This concept is not intuited by the senses, is not represented in imagination. It is only subject matter, the product and content of thought, the fact that exists in and for itself, the logos, the reason of that which is, the truth of that what we call things. It is, least of all, the logos that should be kept outside the science of logic. It cannot therefore be a matter of choice whether to include it within the science or leave it out, when the thought determinations, which are only external forms, are seriously considered in themselves. Sorry, my dog's eating a bone. With the thought determinations, which are only external forms, are seriously considered themselves, the result can only be the demonstration of their finitude and of the untruth of their supposed being for itself, and that the concept is their truth. Therefore, inasmuch as the science of logic deals with the thought determinations that instinctively and unconsciously pervade our spirit everywhere and remain non-objectified and unnoticed, even when they enter language, it will also be a reconstruction of those determinations which reflection has already abstracted and fixed as subjective forms external to material content. So that thing sentence in the middle, but a concept is also, first of all, in itself the concept. And this concept is only one concept, the substantial foundation. It is, of course, also a determinate concept, and in this, its determinateness that appears in it as a content, even though in fact it is a form determination of the substantial unity of the concept, a moment of the form as totality of the concept itself, which is the foundation of the determinate concepts. It's a very technical, very specific, very precise way of talking about what logic in itself is. When we have, logic for Hegel is essentially the thinking of thinking, which means the concept of the concept. And the concept is the conception of concepts. It's how we generate concepts in the first place. So it's the concept of the generation of concepts. And so since you have that as a concept, it literally becomes the self-generation of the concept. There's only one concept because there's one way and one way alone in which concepts are generated and unified in the mind. Any differences and distinctions you could make about the concept are nonetheless conceptual distinctions and therefore fall into the concept again. Alright, so continuing. The presentation of no subject matter can be in and for itself as strictly and immanently plastic as is that of thought in its necessary development, nor would any subject matter require such a representation. In this respect, the science of logic must surpass even mathematics, for no subject matter intrinsically possesses this freedom and independence. The presentation would demand that at no stage of the development should any thought determination or reflection occur that does not directly emerge at that specific stage and does not proceed in it from the preceding determinations a demand which is also to be found after a fashion in the process of mathematical inference. But I must admit that such an abstract perfection of presentation must generally be renounced. The very fact that the logic must begin with the purely simple, and therefore the most general and empty, restricts it to expressions of this simple that are themselves absolutely simple, without the further addition of a single word. Only allowed, as the matter at hand requires, would be negative reflections intended to ward off and keep at bay whatever the imagination or an undisciplined thinking might otherwise adventitiously bring in. However, such intrusive elements in the otherwise simple imminent course of the development are essentially accidental, and the effort to ward them off would, therefore, be itself tainted with this accidentality, and besides, it would be futile to try to deal with them all, precisely because they lie outside the essence of the subject matter, and incompleteness is at best what would have to do to satisfy systematic expectations. So, that is actually an attack on the way in which certain philosophers and how philosophy in general is like taught nowadays to be put forth, which is you got to put forth your position, but you got to put forth the counter arguments too. And of course, you can't think of every single counter argument, and you can't answer every single counter argument. As far as Hegel's concerned, answering counter arguments is pointless. The only counter-arguments to be answered are the arguments which arise from whatever you're doing immediately and necessarily. A lot of people will bring in things about, well, isn't Hegel, forgetting this? Isn't he not paying attention to that? And Hegel's response in the work is merely, well, that's not really relevant to this at this point. So it's also one of the reasons why it's a great place to start with the logic, in that it's mostly about the positive build-up. It's not about him dealing with arguments from other people against his philosophy. As a matter of fact, I don't know very many places where Hegel ever deals with anyone who specifically attacked his philosophy, so much as he deals with the people who have positions which are well known, in which he knows that most readers of his time being taught about by other people are not the way in which he's talking about them, which is why he says these are negative reflections. They would be negative reflections intended to ward off and keep at bay whatever the imagination or as undisciplined thinking might otherwise adventitiously bring in. So a lot of the commentaries he will make within the text are merely to, in case you were thinking he was saying something in terms of someone else, usually it'll be him like saying, no, I'm not saying that. However, such intrusive elements in the otherwise simple immanent course of development are essentially accidental, and the effort to ward them off would therefore be itself tainted with this accidentality. And besides, it would be futile. Okay, I already read that. Yet the restlessness and the distraction characteristic of our modern consciousness leaves us no choice but to also take into account the more current of these reflections and these adventitious notions. A plastic discourse requires a plasticity of sense also in hearing and understanding. But youths and men of such temper who would calmly suppress their own reflections and opinions, in which original thought is so impatient to manifest itself, such listeners attentive to the facts as Plato portrayed them, could hardly be imagined in a modern dialogue, and even less could one count on readers of similar disposition. On the contrary, all too often and all too vehemently have I been confronted by opponents incapable of the simple consideration that their opinions and objections imply categories which are presuppositions and themselves in need of being criticized first before they are put to use. Lack of self-awareness in this matter is incredibly profound. It is responsible for the misunderstanding which is the cause of all others. The nasty and uneducated practice of taking for a category under consideration something other than this category itself. This lack of self-awareness is all the less justifiable when this something other consists of determinate thoughts and concepts, and these other categories would also would have to have a place in a system of logic and be subjected there to examination on their own. This is most conspicuously the case in the vast majority of the objections and attacks on the first concepts or propositions of the logic, on being and nothing, and on becoming, which itself a simple determination contains, indisputably indeed, as the simplest analysis shows, the other two determinations as moments. Thoroughness seems to require that the beginning, as the foundation upon which everything else is built, should be examined before all else. In fact, that we should not proceed further until its solidity has been demonstrated, and if the contrary should be the case, that we reject all that follows. This thoroughness has the added advantage of guaranteeing that the labor of thinking is reduced to a minimum, for it has, therefore, enclosed in this germ the entire development, and reckons that it has settled the whole business when it has disposed of the beginning, the easiest matter of dispatch, because it is the simplest, the simple itself. It is the trifling labor required for this that really recommends this thoroughness, which is so satisfied with itself. This restriction to the simple allows free play to the arbitrariness of thought, which will not itself remain simple, but brings in its own reflections on the subject. Having good right to occupy itself at first only with the principle, and therefore not to let itself be involved in anything else, this industrious thoroughness in fact does the very opposite, for it does bring in the else, that is, other categories besides just the principle, extra presuppositions and prejudices. Such presuppositions as that infinity is different from finitude, content something else in form, the inner something else in the outer, likewise that mediation is not immediacy, as if anyone did not know these things, are didactically presented, narrated, and affirmed rather than demonstrated. There's something stupid, I have no other word for it, about this didactic mannerism. At a deeper level, there is the legitimacy of simply presupposing and straightaway accepting such presuppositions. Still more, there is a failure to recognize that the requirement in the business of logical thinking is to investigate precisely this, whether apart from infinity a finite would be by itself something true. Likewise, whether such an abstracted infinity, or whether a content without form or a form without content, an inner by itself without further externalization, an externality without inwardness, whether any of this would be something true or something actual. But this culture and discipline of thought by which the latter acquires plasticity and overcomes the impatience of incidental reflection is procured solely by pressing onward, by study, and by carrying out to its conclusion the entire development. Anyone who in our times labors at erecting a new and independent edifice of philosophical sciences may be reminded, thinking of how Plato expounded his, of the story that he reworked his Republic 7 times over. The reminder of this, any comparison, such as may seem implied in it, should only serve to incite ever stronger the wish that for a work which, as belonging to the modern world, is confronted by a profounder principle, a more difficult subject matter, and a material of greater compass, the unfettered leisure had been afforded of reworking it 77 times over. But the author, in face of the magnitude of the task, had to content himself with what could be made of its circumstances of external necessity, of the inevitable distraction caused by the magnitude and multitude of contemporary interests, all the while in doubt whether the noisy clamor of the day and the deafening chatter of a conceit that takes pride in confining itself to just these interests might still leave room for partaking in the dispassionate calm of a knowledge dedicated to thought alone. Berlin, November 7th, 1831. All right, any comments by anybody on that? No, well, actually, maybe have some comments myself. So, I mean, the critique of others as, which critiqued Hegel as using concepts that they themselves have not thoroughly justified, ends up being the same critique that I noticed that other people still use to defend Hegel against later attacks. People like Kierkegaard, people like Nietzsche, people like Heidegger, pretty much everyone who says, like, well, you know, Hegel may have been right about this, this, and this, and that, but he didn't take into account this other thing. And then they start deploying a concept which they tell us is beyond concepts. You know, they're not talking about a concept, but, you know, the real being as such, the being of beings, as Heidegger might put it. Kierkegaard then says, you need something like faith, blah, blah, blah. All of these things, Hegel would say, are unjustified. They're presupposing concepts of logic which they themselves have clearly not justified as such. So, we cannot take those attacks on face value of how they operate in a concrete sense as being, even if they use those concepts consistently and coherently and apply them in a way that makes sense and has meaning, nonetheless that meaning as meaning itself has not been justified in the sense of justifying what meaning itself is or what truth as such is, to be understood as a thought, and not as something reflective of some objective reality out there. So those things need to be justified. I think that makes sense to demand that of anyone who would attack Hegel on any other ground. Then there's also a little bit he mentions about where he talks about the thoroughness of simplicity and how people get a self-satisfied view of things because they find a form that works. You even see this with people who call themselves Hegelians, weirdly enough, in which they'll speak about dialectics and they'll bring about the clear dialectics of this and that. Marxists harp on about the dialectics of commodities, the clear contradiction between use value and exchange value, but try this and ask them, what is the actual contradiction between use value and exchange value? What makes that necessary? Because the way Marx puts it forth in Capital does not actually explain to you why these two categories actually have anything to do with each other. As a matter of fact, in your everyday life, you don't consider them to have anything to do with each other imminently as necessary contradictions. Why would you oppose exchange value with use value, for example? Wouldn't you oppose use value with just its direct opposite, uselessness? I don't even know what you would think of exchange value being opposed to, as opposed to the unexchangeable. But what does it have to do directly with just general use value? I don't know. So contradictions of that sort or oppositions of that sort are not justified. They may sound good. People then go ahead and say, compare Hegel, for example, and say, oh, well, what's so special about Hegelianism anyways? The Chinese, Taoists, had the yin and yang millennia before Hegel. Who cares? It's nothing special. The Indians also had dialectical logic with Nagarjuna. Who cares? This whole thing that, Hegel's unique and, nobody else has ever discovered dialectics or anything. It's just BS. Well, because look at all these other things. But if you look at those other things, they don't function the same way at all. There is no justification for why things are opposites as opposites. They're recognized as opposites, but they're not really revealed as imminently necessarily oppositional. Except for certain things like cause and effect, in which, the reason cause and effect are opposed is simply because it's in their very concept already. A cause is an effect is caused by a cause, or is the effect of a cause. And in those, you're like, okay, well, we can grasp their imminent connection, at least on the definitional level, but why you would grasp that as a contradiction or an opposition of terms is not exactly clear from the get-go. So, you actually have to explain the opposition itself. And that is certainly probably the most difficult part of what Hegel has to achieve, because I don't think Hegel himself does a very good job in some movements about really making it clear why certain things are really opposed to each other and why they're imminently transform can be seen to necessarily transform into their opposite. People talk a lot about that and say, things necessarily turn into their opposites, but there's no explanation as to why. That's probably one of my biggest pet peeves about just Hegelians in general, so-called Hegelians, in which they will talk a lot about these things that are only obvious to them. And when you actually ask them to explain them, they themselves have no idea why these things are actually the case. So we'll get to that. We'll get to seeing that once we get into the actual text. Here in the introductions, we still have some setup to go. The introductions are going to be mainly about two things. Both of them, in their own way, are meant to do one thing, which is to get you to understand that you need to put aside all your preconceptions about everything you think you know about anything, really. The logic really only works if you just stop opposing it and you just go along with it. That's what we are going to get partly out of the general concept of logic, but it's particularly what you get with what must the science begin, that we just simply have to stop presupposing that we know what we're talking about and just get on with the business of talking about these extremely primitive concepts, and then we'll see where it goes. So let's get on to the first introduction, the general concept of logic. In no science is the need to begin with the fact itself, without preliminary reflections, felt more strongly than in the science of logic. In every other science, the matter that it treats and the scientific method are distinguished from each other. The content, moreover, does not make an absolute beginning, but is dependent on other concepts and is connected on all sides with other material. It is therefore permitted to these sciences to speak of their ground and its context, as well as their method, in the form of lemmas, to apply presupposed forms of definitions and the like without further ado, as known and accepted, and to make use of customary ways of argumentation in order to establish their general concepts and fundamental determinations. Logic, on the contrary, cannot presuppose any of these forms of reflection, these rules and laws of thinking, for they are part of its content and they first have to be established within it. And it is not just a declaration of scientific method, but the concept itself of science as such that belongs to its content and even makes up its final result. Logic, therefore, cannot say what it is in advance. Rather, does this knowledge of itself only emerge as the final result and completion of its whole treatment. Likewise, its subject matter, thinking, or more specifically, conceptual thinking, is essentially elaborated within it. Its concept is generated in the course of this elaboration and cannot therefore be given in advance. What is anticipated in this introduction, therefore, is not intended to ground, as it were, the concept of logic, or to justify in advance its content and method scientifically, but rather to make more intuitable, by means of some explanations and reflections on argumentative and historical nature, the standpoint from which this science ought to be considered. Whenever logic is taken as the science of thinking in general, it is thereby understood that this thinking constitutes the mere form of a cognition, that logic abstracts from all content, and the so-called second constitutive piece that belongs to the cognition, namely the matter, must be given from elsewhere. Hence that logic, since this matter does not in the least depend on it, can give only the formal conditions of genuine knowledge, but does not itself contain real truth. Or again, that logic is only the pathway to real knowledge, for the essential component of truth, the content, lies outside it. But first, to say that logic abstracts from all content, that it only teaches the rule of thinking without being able to engage in what is being thought or to take its composition into consideration, this alone is already inadequate. For since thinking and the rules of thinking are supposed to be its subject matter, and in these, logic already has a content specifically its own. In them, it has that second constituent of knowledge, namely a matter whose composition is its concern. But second, the notions in which the concept of logic has generally rested so far have in part already passed away, and for the rest, it is time that they disappear altogether, that the point of this science were grasped at a higher level, and that the science gained a completely altered shape. The concept of logic has hitherto rested on a separation, presupposed once and for all in ordinary consciousness, of the content of knowledge and its form, or of truth and certainty. Presupposed from the start is that the material of knowledge is present in and for itself as a ready-made world outside thinking, that thinking is by itself empty, that it comes to this material as a form from outside, fills itself with it, and only then gains a content, thereby becoming real knowledge. Further, these two component parts, for they are supposed to be related to each other as component parts, and cognition is compounded from them in a mechanical, or at best, chemical manner, are set to stand to each other in this order. The object is complete and finished all by itself, and, for its actuality, can fully dispense with thought. Thought, for its part, is something deficient, and in need of material in order to complete itself, and also, as a pliable, indeterminate form, must adapt itself to its matter. Truth is the agreement of thought with the subject matter, and in order to produce this agreement, for it is not there on its own account, thought is expected to be subservient and responsive to the subject matter. Third, when the difference of matter and form, of subject matter and thought, is not left in this nebulous indeterminacy, but is more specifically defined, each turns out to be a sphere divorced from the other. Consequently, as thought receives it and informs the material, it does not transcend itself, but its reception of this material and its responsiveness to it remain modifications of itself. Thus thought does not become its other. The self-conscious determining, at any rate, belongs only to it. Even as it refers to the subject matter, therefore, it does not reach out to it outside itself. The subject matter remains a thing in itself, utterly a beyond of thought. These views on the relation of subject and object to each other express the determinations that constitute the nature of our ordinary phenomenal consciousness. However, when these prejudices are carried over to reason, as if in reason the same relation is obtained, as if this relation had in truth in and for itself, when they are errors, and the refutation of them in every part of the spiritual and natural universe is what philosophy is, or rather, since they block the entrance to philosophy, they are the errors that must be removed before one can enter it. Okay, for those of you not aware, this is all referring back to Kantianism, Kant's critique of pure reason, of dividing what is knowable according to the categories of the mind, which form the basis of our judgments, and judgments form the basis of knowledge, but none of these are knowledge of the world or things in themselves, things as they truly are according to Kant. Those things, because they are not thoughts themselves, are only molded and shaped and represented by thought, and therefore by the time we apprehend them as objects of experience, which then also are objects of knowledge, they are not what they are prior to being inframed within our cognition. Another way to put that more simply is our mind has the categories, the concepts, the forms of thought. We form objects of knowledge with these concepts. The content that goes into them are these intuitions of things outside us, but then these intuitions themselves are forms or intuitive forms of this cognition. So, things are spatial, things are temporal, but then Kant says, no, but that's still only a form of our own mind. They are the form of our intuition. And therefore we can't say there are things out there which are in space, which are temporal, which have color, which have taste, blah, 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 blah. Sam Thomas asks, so is the crux of the argument here that Hegel believes that A, logic is unlike other sciences in that it cannot separate its method from the object it studies, and B, thought cannot be thought simpliciter but must have an object about which thought concerns itself? yes to A, no to B, in the sense that thought must have a content, obviously, but that content, it does not have to be what Kant talked about, which has to be some intuited, sensuous content. Kant says rationalism is true in that we have forms of cognition, that we have innate concepts through which we comprehend the world, but empiricism is true likewise in that the truth of the world lies in the empirical objects which we cognize. So, our thought can only be valid but not true. In order to attain truth, we have to have that unity between the empirical and the purely rational. And Hegel says, no, actually, the purely rational is itself a content. The form is itself content, and content is itself form. What does he mean when he talks about prejudices being carried over to reason? I didn't really understand the comparison. What he means is, let me reread that. What was that? That paragraph states, these views on the relation of subject and object to each other express the determinations that constitute the nature of ordinary phenomenal consciousness. However, when these prejudices are carried over to reason, as if in reason the same relation obtained, as if this relation had any truth in and for itself, then they are errors, and the refutation of them in every part of the spiritual natural universe is what philosophy is. What he means is that the way in which we have the view of the unity of thoughts and empirical objects, and that unity provides a truth. If you then Kant, this is not Hegel's view, but this is Kant's standpoint. You cannot take that properly correct, but still like a erroneous intuition of how we know things to also apply to thought itself. Reason can become an object of its own cognition, but as far as Kant goes, reason is not a proper object. The categories are not proper objects of knowledge. The categories are given, we know we have them, we know how they operate, but we cannot say whether the categories themselves are true. We cannot say whether they are false. We can only say we have them and we require them for our cognition. Beyond that, so we can say that if I grab a ball and I throw it, and we have the relation of cause there, and Kant would say, okay, we could say that I am the cause, the efficient cause of the ball going off, flying off, somewhere else. I threw it. I'm the cause. It is the effect. But then, likewise, we cannot then turn around and talk about what is the cause of cause, or what is the reason for cause. That's part of what the antinomies are for. The antinomies are for showing that in reason itself, we don't actually have a very good basis for determining things in the way that we do when we have empirical objects. Because with reason we have the antinomies in which we can have completely contradictory statements like the universe is finite, or the universe is infinite, time is finite, or the universe began, or it didn't begin. And both of those can be completely validly, rationally argued. And in pure reason alone, says Kant, we cannot actually determine which is true and which is false. They are equally true and to that extent equally false. And so therefore the concepts of truth and falsity don't properly apply to the categories themselves. Sam Thomas says, I think A can lead to an interesting critique of the way that, for example, Frege and Russell conceived logic. This is a merely formal method upon which one can apply whatever content one wishes. It definitely 100% applies to that. So continuing, the older metaphysics had in this respect a higher concept of thinking than now passes as the accepted opinion, for it presupposed as its principle that only what is known of things and in things by thought is really true in them, that is, what is known in them, not in their immediacy, but as first elevated to the form of thinking, as things of thought. This metaphysics thus held that thinking, the determination of thinking, are not something alien to the subject matters, but are rather their essence, or that the things and the thinking of them agree in and for themselves. Also, our language expresses a kinship between them. The thinking in its immanent determinations and the true nature of things are one and the same content. So this is one of the few passages in which you can talk about a kind of exposition about the normally strangely considered a view that thought and being are one and the same. I think I mentioned last time that you'll never really have Hegel give an argument for why this is, except I think that as you work through the logic, you find out very clearly why this is. And this example he gives here is sort of one of those things that you might call intuitive with everyday reason, that the very fact that you think that through a process of rationality you arrive at the truth of things already implicitly shows that you are committed to the fact that there is somehow an identity between thought and being itself. Not as empirical being, but true being. You know, you see an illusion out in the desert, a mirage. You walk towards it, it disappears. You're like, okay, well, you know, that was just a mere appearance. It wasn't truth. You know, the truth of the fact is now, it's just all desert. It's just all sand. And then you could have all this whole rational explanation of water vapor reflecting light off of the atmosphere, through the atmosphere, blah blah blah. Nonetheless, that is something that is not immediately sensuously apparent. It is not immediately rationally apparent. You have to do a process of mediated cognition to arrive at a concept of what is truly the case in whatever event is happening or whatever things you're grasping. So that's one way in which one can say that there is a clear indication in our very everyday practices, in the very belief of rationality itself. Even people who don't believe in rationality, nonetheless, strangely enough, are relying on rationality to tell us the truth about rationality. You can be Nietzsche, and Nietzsche says, truth is worthless, it's all about power. Well, how do you arrive at that truth, Nietzsche? Well, through reason. Otherwise, a properly Nietzschean argument would have nothing to do with writing books and making these negative arguments, but rather would be about a fist in your face. And if you asked, there are some Nietzscheans, I think, that would probably go and say, that's the only true argument, a fist in your face. That's also probably, that's properly speaking that level of rationality which we're speaking of. And even then, that would still be a mediated form of rationality, which implicitly is also pointing to the fact that the immediacy of things is not really what they are. And then that highly mediated form of that would have to lead you to a process of cognition, even if it is not a conceptual cognition, but a cognition nonetheless, which then would only be understood through a concept of that non-conceptual cognition, which lands you right back into that issue of you can't escape the concept, ultimately. No matter how you want to spin it, at least I don't see how it makes sense that you can escape it. Even if your argument is a fist to a face, nonetheless, the fact that you posit that as an argument, as a kind of rationality, shows that there is a concept working there. Continuing. But the reflection of the understanding seized hold of philosophy. We must know exactly what is meant by this saying, which is otherwise often used as a slogan. It refers in general to an understanding that abstracts and therefore separates, that remains fixed in its separations. Turned against reason, this understanding behaves in the manner of ordinary common sense, giving credence to the latter's view that truth rests on sensuous reality, that thoughts are only thoughts, that is, that only sense perception gives feeling and reality to them, that reason, insofar as it abides in and for itself, generates only mental figments. In this self-renunciation of reason, the concept of truth is lost, is restricted to the knowledge of mere subjective truth, of mere appearances, of only something to which the nature of the fact does not correspond. Knowledge has lapsed into opinion. And that judgment is pretty much the judgment of all the German idealists after Kant, including the people who weren't German idealists but still reacted negatively towards Kant, which is that if you took Kantianism seriously, that all that we can know is appearances but not things in themselves, then the proper judgment of that is that what you're saying is we actually can never know anything. All we have is human opinion. And even though we may have a consistent human opinion, it is nonetheless an opinion and nothing more. And that is a view which anti-humanists in general have taken after Kant. People who are against our anthropocentrism, who are against the idea that we humans have access to the true way in which things are. Maybe dogs experience the world in such a radically different way that they know something we don't, in a way that is non-conceptual, which, God knows what you would call it. But somehow, the world could be radically different from what it appears to us. This is also something inherent to the concept of realism, in which, realism holds that the world is non-conceptual, that, it is another version of the thing in itself, though realism is not necessarily it's usually a pre-Kantian thing rather than a Kantian thing, but that implication is sometimes implicitly there and sometimes explicitly there about the fact that there is a possibility that our cognition can be so diluted that the world itself is completely different to how we conceive it. That we may have a coherent and internally complete conceptual scheme, and yet nonetheless the world may actually be completely otherwise. Of course, with something like that, we'll get some arguments later on from Hegel in Chapter 2 about how this cannot possibly be the case, just simply based on the concept of things existing. Continuing, yet there is something deeper lying at the foundation of this turn which knowledge takes and appears as a lost and a retrograde step, something on which the elevation of reason to the loftier spirit of modern philosophy in fact rests. The basis of that conception, now universally accepted, is to be sought namely in the insight into the necessary conflict of the determinations of the understanding with themselves. The reflection already mentioned consists in transcending the concrete immediate, in determining and parting it, but this reflection must equally transcend its separating determinations and above all connect them. The conflict of determinations breaks out precisely at the point of connection. This reflective activity of connection belongs in itself to reason, and to rise above the determinations and attain insight into their discord is the great negative step in the way to the true concept of reason. But when not carried through, this insight runs into the misconception that reason is the one that contradicts itself. It fails to see that the contradiction is in fact the elevation of reason above the restrictions of the understanding and the dissolution of them. At that point, instead of making the final step that would take it to the summit, knowledge flees from the unsatisfactoriness of the determinations of the understanding to sensuous existence, believing that there it will find stability and accord. On the other hand, since its cognition is self-admittedly a cognition only of appearances, the unsatisfactoriness of the latter is admitted, but at the same time presupposed, as much as to say that although we do have cognition of things in themselves, nevertheless, within the sphere of appearance, we do have correct cognition, as if, so to speak, there were a difference only in the kind of subject matters, and one kind, namely the things in themselves, does not fall within the scope of knowledge, whereas the other kind, namely the appearances, does. This is like attributing right insight to someone with the stipulation, however, that he is not fit to see what is true, but only what is false. Absurd as this might be, no less absurd would be a cognition which is true, but does not know its subject matter as it is in itself. So this is a great little, it's a big paragraph. But that first half of that paragraph is a little bit of insight into the method. For example, he talks about the necessary conflict of the determinations of the understanding with themselves. talks about the reflection already mentioned consists in transcending the concrete immediate, in determining and parting it. So part of the method is going to involve, it's this whole thing of, the abstract, negative, concrete. The abstract is that immediate. It is that singular in the abstract taken as the whole. Reflect, to determine is to part it, to give it detail, to give a definition. We will start with being, and then we have to say, well, being is. In order to say the is itself is a sort of split within being itself. It's the negative, it's a reflection within itself. But without that, we cannot determine anything. We are left in indeterminacy. We don't know what we have. So, but this reflection must equally transcend its separating determinations and above all connect them. The conflict of determinations breaks out precisely at the point of connection. Hegel has a specific term for this. He calls it negative unity. You see this in the phenomenology quite a lot. And it means exactly what it says. That at the point at which you have the breakdown of things, the very separation of things, that separation is exactly the thing that connects them. It is like, let me see if I see this properly. Where did it go? It is like my two hands in space. And you say, well, they're separated by space. Well, the very way in which you can understand that very separation is through this negative unification we call space. That space which divides is the very thing which links these two things together. You cannot conceive of it any other way. And to say you cannot conceive of it of any other way is literally also to say that this cannot possibly be any other way. That were there not a spatial separation between these two material objects, which are my hands, there wouldn't be hands at all. We wouldn't have two hands. Actually, we probably wouldn't even have a hand. It literally could not possibly make sense. Dan says negative unity is kind of like the punctuation of slash. It separates yet connects. Actually, it is precisely, it's also what is called the judgment. When you say being is X or whatever, that is demarcates a separation between the subject and its predicates. It tells you they are different, and at the same time it also identifies them. It unifies them. It tells you that these two things, which are separate, also come together as one thing. So that's something that you can keep in mind. I think that's a helpful thing. It certainly helped me when I understood it. And once you see it, you'll find a lot of use for it. But he says, continuing, but this reflection must equally transcend its separating determinations, above all connect them. The conflict of determinations breaks out precisely at the point of connection. This reflective activity of connection belongs in itself to reason, and to rise above the determinations that attain insight into their discord is the great negative step on the way to the true concept of reason. So, the understanding arrives at the antinomies. It arrives at the dialectic. And it says, okay, we have a contradiction. One of these things, if one of these things is true, the other one's not true. But both of them seem to be true. Therefore, both of them are either both of them are true and this is nonsense, or both of them are not true and this is nonsense. And what reason does, according to Hegel, what true proper reason does is it finally sees that contradiction, that inflection point, that what he says, that point of connection, which is also the breakdown. It is the point in which we see their discord. That point is precisely the point at which you have achieved sublation. You are literally one hair away from going from the finite to the infinite, and all it takes is just that little flip of cognitive perception to go from I'm in a dialectic, I am in a contradiction, this is nonsense to just take a little shift of perception from understanding to reason, and all of a sudden this changes into this makes perfectly good sense. It is completely intelligible. It is not nonsense. It is completely coherent, and it is what is rationally the case. Dan asks, so reason is able to recognize and accept what the understanding cannot. This contradiction, right? Yes. It recognizes the contradiction not only as a negative dissonance, but also as being the point of connection. This is also why it's called the negation of negation in a certain fashion. Because this extreme negation, which happens in the dialectic, is also, in being precisely this negation, the very thing which stabilizes the dialectic and makes it stand out as a substantial unity which endures and can stabilize this new concept. All right, continuing. The second half of that paragraph is actually also pretty good. That critique that, it makes no sense. And I mean, truly think about it. It makes no sense to say that we can't know the truth of the world in itself, which is also just to say, really, we can't know truth. But hey, we can know falsehood. We can't know the truth of things in themselves, but we can know the truth of appearances, that is, falsehoods. And Hegel's point there is, that's absolute nonsense. That is literally nonsensical. Because in order to know something as false, you have to implicitly have the actual grasp of the truth. There has to be an element of truth, which is, according to the Kantian view of things, an element of the world in itself, which is unknowable. It's the thing in itself, which is not exactly the exact same as the noumena, but it's related. It's both knowing having an access to a thing in itself, a truth, and a noumena, which is a truth of that sort. Another way to say it is to put that as sort of a reflexive question of like, okay, well, you're telling us that reason is limited to only, knowing so much and only knowing about appearances. Well, how do you know that reason itself, that your own reason is valid and capable of determining this? Because through the understanding, it seems that we can know so much, and that, but it takes, we have to nonetheless stand back from the understanding, critique it. According to Kant, that's why we have a critique of pure reason. Because while we're in it, it seems to be universal, and it seems to work for everything. But we got to step back from it, see, no, it actually doesn't. Well, then you still have to make a critique further of the reason which critiques that kind of reason. And I mean, that doesn't just obviously generalize to Kant, but that literally generalizes to everybody, right? Everybody who takes that Kantian transcendental framework about, oh, well, there is a real out there, but, here all we have is text, here all we have is signifiers, here all we have is representations, here all we have is just illusions, whatever you want to call it. That distinction between the real world, the truth, which is unreachable by mind, everybody falls to this critique in which, well, how then do you know that this thing which you determine to be the case, as according to our falsehoods, has in itself any truth at all? So continuing, the critique of the forms of the understanding has arrived precisely at this result, namely that such forms do not apply to things in themselves. This can only mean that they are in themselves something untrue. However, since they have been allowed to remain valid for reason and experience, the critique has not altered them in any way, but rather has let them be for the subject in the same shape as they formerly applied to the object. But if they are inadequate for the thing in itself, still less must the understanding to which they are supposedly belong have to put up with them and rest content with them. If they cannot be determinations of the thing in itself, still less can they be determinations of the understanding, to which one ought to concede at least the dignity of a thing. The determinations of finite and infinite run into the same conflict, whether they are applied to time and space, to the world, or determinations internal to the spirit, just as black and white yield gray, whether they are mixed on a wall or on a palette. If a representation of the world is dissolved when we carry over to it the determinations of the infinite and the finite, still more is spirit itself, which contains both determinations within itself, something inwardly self-contradictory, self-dissolving. If not the nature of the material or the subject matter to which they are applied, in which they are found, that can make a difference, for it is only through such determinations and in accordance with them that the subject matter has contradiction within it. And I know he's starting to use the term spirit. In this sense, just consider it mind. The said critique has therefore removed the forms of objective thinking only from the thing, but has left them in the subject as it originally found them. That is to say, it did not consider them in and for themselves according to their proper content, but simply took them over from subjective logic in the manner of lemmas. There was no question, therefore, of an imminent deduction of such forms, or also deducing them as logico-subjective forms, still less of a dialectical treatment of them. In its more consistent form, Transcendental Idealism did recognize the nothingness of the spectral thing in itself, this abstract shadow divorced from all content left over by critical philosophy, and its goal was to destroy it completely. This philosophy also made a start at letting reason produce its determinations from itself, but the subjective attitude assumed in the attempt prevented it from coming to fruition. This attitude, and together with it, the attempt and the cultivation of pure science, were eventually abandoned. Here he's referring to Johann Fichte, who is a great philosopher. If you haven't read Fichte, he's worth reading. I also think he's a very good writer, at least in like his style. Not that it's clear. It's worse than Hegel. It's worse than Kant, probably. The way he writes is very dense and not straightforward. But you can follow it if you work at it. And when you grasp something, you're like, wow, that's pretty ingenious. He also, whenever he goes on screeds against somebody, it's fantastic. Okay, I see somebody's writing a comment. Let's see. Megan says, I found Fichte a bit easier than Kant, but I guess I didn't read too much. It depends, I suppose. I haven't read that much either, but I read like the first chapters of the Wissenschaftler, the science of knowledge, and they're not there. Depending on like how careful you are at reading, they can be very difficult. Is Schelling a good writer? I would place him in the sort of same kind of writing as Fichte. If you have the patience and you're interested in the subject matter, they have some really great insights. They also have their moments in which they achieve very poetic and beautiful writing. I think they're both good thinkers. They're not my favorites, but I definitely can give them a positive count on that. The only thing I've directly read from Schelling is the essay on freedom, the Freiheitsschrift, which originally I hated, and then after many years I've gone back and read it again, and I found it to be much better, probably much easier to understand that after you have gotten a lot of practice with just conceptual thought in general. It's not really a thing of like, oh well, Hegel is just so difficult that his difficulty compared to them is going to make it so much easier. Not really. I think that if you can get a handle of conceptual thinking with anybody, you could do this with Plato, you could do this with Fichte, Schelling, anybody. It really just is a commitment to trying to think the meaning of things as opposed to just being formal with it. And then I think that generally crosses over to all philosophy, but no matter like who writes. As a matter of fact, it just makes people who are formal quite boring. Continuing, but what is commonly understood by logic is considered with a total disregard of metaphysical significance. This science, in the state in which it still finds itself, has admittedly no content of the kind which ordinary consciousness would accept as reality, or as a genuine fact. But it is not for that reason a formal science void of any material truth. Besides, the region of truth is not to be sought in that material missing in it, a lack to which the insufficiency of logic is usually attributed. More to the point is that the emptiness of logical forms lies rather solely in the manner in which they are considered and dealt with. Scattered and fixed determinations is thus not held together in organic unity. They are dead forms in the spirit, which is their vital concrete unity does not reside in them. Therefore they lack proper content, a matter that would in itself be substance. The content which is missed in the logical forms is nothing else than a fixed foundation and a concretion of these abstract determinations, and such a substantial being is usually sought for them outside them. But logical reason is itself the substantial or real factor which, within itself, holds together all the abstract determinations and constitutes their proper, absolutely concrete unity. There is no need, therefore, to look far and wide for what is usually called a matter. It is not the fault of the subject matter of logic, as the latter seems empty, but only of the manner in which the subject matter is grasped. This reflection brings us to the statement of the standpoint from which logic is to be considered, of how this standpoint differs from the previous treatments of this science, and is alone the true base on which the science is to rest in the future. In the Phenomenology of Spirit, I have presented consciousness as it progresses from the first immediate opposition of itself and the subject matter to absolute knowledge. This path traverses all the forms of the relation of consciousness to the object, and its result is the concept of science. There is no need, therefore, to justify this concept here, apart from the fact that it emerges within logic itself. It has already been justified in the other work, and would indeed not be capable of any other justification than is produced by consciousness, as all its shapes dissolve into that concept as into their truth. A discursive justification or explanation of the concept of science can yield at best a general notion of it and a historical acquaintance, but a definition of science, or more precisely of logic, has its proof only in the necessity of the matter it is produced by consciousness, as just mentioned. Any definition with which a science makes an absolute beginning can contain nothing else than the precise and correct expression of what is represented in one's mind as the traditionally accepted subject matter and purpose of the science. That just this subject matter and this purpose are so represented as a historical warrant for invoking such or such fact as conceded, or more precisely only for pleading that such or such fact should be accepted as conceded. There will always be the possibility that someone else will adduce a case, an instance, in which something more and different must be understood by some term or other, a term which is therefore to be defined in a narrower or broader sense, and the science, too, will have to be refashioned accordingly. Further still, definition is always a matter of argumentation as to what is to be included in it or excluded from it, within which limits and to what extent, but argumentation is open to the most manifold and various opinions, and on these
a decision can finally be determined only arbitrarily. In this method of beginning science with a definition, no mention is made of the need to demonstrate the necessity of its subject matter, and hence the necessity of the science itself. So here there's obviously a mention of the phenomenology of spirit. Don't worry, you don't have to have read it in order to read this book, because the only way the phenomenology of spirit justifies science or logic, which is this book, is in a negative justification. What the phenomenology of spirit does is, if you're really obsessive about epistemology and ontology as first philosophy, and you just cannot accept that it makes sense that we begin with logic as logic, and that logic can be a content for itself, that can be entirely self-contained within itself, as itself, then indeed you need to go through the phenomenology of spirit. But if you don't have that kind of problem, if you're not going to be constantly being pulled away in your consciousness by reading any of what he says throughout the book, particularly the very beginning, and you just go along with it, it will become perfectly intelligible what science is and why science is from within the standpoint of this very work itself. Mainly because the justification of science as science, logic as logic, is the work of logic, not the work of phenomenology. Excuse me. So if you haven't read the phenomenology, do not worry about it. The second half of that, that this subject matter and this purpose are so represented as a historical warrant for invoking such or such fact is conceded, or more precisely, only for pleading that such or such a fact should be accepted or conceded. There will always be the possibility that someone else will deduce a case, an instance in which something more indifferent must be understood by some term or other. This is something that I actually like very much about Hegelianism. This whole little section is a sort of just general indication that Hegelianism does not play the definition game. Many in philosophy think that an essential part of philosophy is having this definition game of, okay, well, I put forth what I think being is, and then somebody else comes along and says, no, you don't really understand what being is. What being really is this other thing. And then somebody says, no, you don't understand what being is. What being really is this other thing. And then somebody says, oh, you're all wrong. You've been misunderstanding being this whole time. Being is power, being is the being of beings, being is consciousness, being is thought, and being is blah, 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 blah. You can actually see this all the time within particularly cultural wars right now. I mean, the whole issue of like what even is gender, what even is sex. And doesn't matter how you go about it, somebody, somehow, some way will come up with some definition, some example in which your concept will just fail to capture this particular use of this particular definition. And Hegel's whole argument on that is going to be, we don't care. That is not what is at issue here. What is at issue is not about the ways in which people in the everyday world happen to use everyday language and happen to understand or misunderstand various things. That has ultimately nothing to do with truth. It has nothing to do with conceptual validity. What we are going to be concerned with is simply conceptual structures. Now, we will give conceptual structures a name, obviously, because we can't think without symbolic sounds and languages to go along with them, and we can't communicate without them either. So, we have a certain concept, and we might call it being, we might call it gender, we might call it sex, we might call it law, constitution, whatever. You cannot then, within the Hegelian methodology, put this conceptual structure and dynamic in opposition, in debate, against some other conception that uses the same name. You cannot put the Hegelian concept of the state, for example, in debate, in argument against the Marxist concept of the state, because that's not going to work. You can externally debate anything for any reason for as long as you want. It will produce this type of argumentation does not conduce anything regarding truth. all it can bring up is the popularity of conceptions and definitions, but it has nothing to do with the truth of definitions themselves. And particularly the truth of definitions themselves is entirely to do with just the conceptual side of these definitions. So in many ways, Hegel will come up with concepts that are valid and true in his philosophy, but which may have a name that you disagree with, or I disagree with. For example, the way Hegel defines and conceives women to be, for example, in the philosophy of right, wouldn't be what I consider to be a proper concept of women. Not because then, like Hegel's definition is wrong. It's just because I think that it's not, that concept name doesn't properly fit the generality of what we use and understand by it nowadays. It's Hegel ties women mainly to a particular understanding of femininity, and that understanding can be problematized, can be literally put into the dialectical grinder, and you can very much show that these concepts can literally be inverted. Anything that's feminine can also be inverted into the masculine can be inverted to the feminine. Yeah. Hegel has a gamer moment on women. Yep. So there can be disagreements about the term names, but there cannot really be a disagreement about definitions and about what goes where and how. Unless, of course, there is some kind of development in which clearly there is something that appears that goes between this concept and that concept, and then you can say, well, before we made a move directly from being and nothing to becoming, and becoming to existence, but now we have these new categories that go in between, and we need to account for those. Only then could you have something in which you could probably make an argument about not definitions, so to say, but actually just there's some moves that were hidden in there that need to be now explicated. But beyond that, the definition game is out of the question. Where was I? The concept of pure science and its deduction is therefore presupposed in the present work, insofar as the phenomenology of spirit is nothing other than that deduction. Absolute knowledge is the truth of all the modes of consciousness because, as the course of the phenomenology brought out, it is only in absolute knowledge that the separation of the subject matter from the certainty of itself is completely resolved. Truth has become equal to certainty, and this certainty to truth. Here, one way to understand certainty would be certainty in the relationship of knowledge to the thing in itself, or the truth, and then truth would be just that truth itself. The reason that certainty and truth end up being the same is because what is true is certain, and what is certain is true. In a direct sense, certainty is truth, and truth is certainty. And why is that the case, and how is that the case in the phenomenology of spirit? In the end, we have absolute knowing, which is knowing that knows itself as knowing. Knowledge is knowing, knowing is the knowing of knowledge. So, what is certain is the certainty of itself. It is the absolute cognition, it is cognition of cognition, the thought of thinking, the thinking of thinking, thought of thought, blah, blah, blah. That's generally how it ends up. You can structure that. That certainty and truth are in this sort of relationship in consciousness. And just to, I guess, summarize, well, I already mentioned that. The big revelation at the end of the phenomenology is, wow, the knowing we had all along was actually the knowing of our own knowing. Yay. Everything else, was a knowing of something else. Every time, it was a knowing of sense certainty. It was a knowing of perceived objects. It was a knowing about understood laws, and forces. It was a knowing about desires and consciousness. It was a knowing about the objects of desire. It was a knowing about other consciousnesses. It was a knowing about the relation to the infinite and the unhappy consciousness. It was a knowing about the material world and the objectivity of reason in the world. Within reason, it was a knowing of society, the objective structures of spirit and the state. And then it was a knowing of art and beauty, and then it was a knowing of religion and God. And finally, we break down all those barriers and we realize ultimately all of this is a knowing of knowing itself. So that negative gauntlet is just like pulling off layer after layer of misconception, which is a misconception not because it's a false conception, but it's because an incomplete conception. All the forms of knowing that we find in the phenomenology spirit never go away. They remain. All right, continuing. Pure science thus presupposes the liberation from the opposition of consciousness. It contains thought insofar as this thought is equally the fact as it is in itself, or the fact in itself insofar as this is equally pure thought. As science, truth is pure self-consciousness as it develops itself and has the shape of the self, so that which exists in and for itself is the conscious concept, and the concept as such is that which exists in and for itself. This stuff about consciousness is important, but it's also not that important for this particular work anyways. In the science of logic, mostly we're entirely dealing with thought. Consciousness itself is not really the issue here, and will never really be the issue again. There are some people who think that Hegel holds consciousness to be the absolute. Obviously not. At least not in the way that we intuitively think about self-consciousness. If by consciousness or self-conscious you believe that we're talking about that, what people in the analytical world tend to call the what it's like to be, what it is like to experience anything, that's not consciousness that Hegel understands. The consciousness for Hegel is the structure of a knower and a known. Knowledge is what Hegel calls the real nature of consciousness, that insofar as there's knowledge, there's consciousness. If there is no knowledge, there is no consciousness. So it's not about the intuition of consciousness, but rather just the conceptual dynamic structure of consciousness. And it is in that capacity in which consciousness is thought. And it is that in that way, that aspect of thought and the self, there's this identification between consciousness, the self, and thought, which gets cashed out at the end of the logic in the logic of the concept, which is the subjective logic. It's called subjective for that very reason. It is where the subject arises properly. So might be something you want to keep in mind, but also not something very important. It's the kind of thing in which you might want to take notes of, like, here's some equivalences, and think about them a little bit. Think about how that might make sense just on the everyday way in which we talk about these things. And then as the work continues, the chain of identities increases, and you start getting more of a proper sense of just how these things really come together at various levels and as various analogies. So continuing, the subjective thinking is thus the content of pure science, consequently far from being formal, far from lacking the matter required for an actual and true cognition. It is content which alone has absolute truth, or if one still wanted to make use of the word matter, which alone is the veritable matter, a matter for which the form is nothing external, because this matter is rather pure thought, and hence the absolute form itself. Accordingly, logic is the understood is to be understood as the system of pure reason, as the realm of pure thought. This realm is truth unveiled, truth as it is in and for itself. It can therefore be said this contest is the exposition of God as he is in his eternal essence before the creation of nature and of a finite spirit. And there we go, ladies and gentlemen. He said the thing. If you've heard anything about Hegel, you've probably heard this quote. It's a pretty famous one. A lot of people make a big deal about this. And it's like, oh, see, Hegel's, some kind of spiritualist theist, or, it's his philosophy is all religion. It's nothing but hidden religion under philosophical guise. And in a way, you could say, yeah. In another way, you could say, well, no, not really. The God of Hegel is ultimately very difficult to recognize as the typical God. It's not an individuality that exists separate from us. It's not a thing that precedes us. Here, the talk about creation of the world is metaphorical. It's poetic. It's not literal. There is not God, and then, God creates the universe or whatever. That's not how it works. Really, Hegel later talks about it both in the logic, at the end of the logic, and everywhere else where he talks about religion relating to the logic. The whole idea that there is some kind of like pseudo-time before time exists, pseudo-space before space exists is nonsense. There was never a time in which the universe did not exist. There was never a time in which time did not exist. Time does not begin, time does not end, space does not begin, does not end, the universe does not begin, does not end. God and the categories, the logic itself is this eternal, pan-temporal would probably be the right way to say it. Eternity is a pan-temporal reality. It's not something outside of time, but it's something immanent at every and all points of time. That's what the meaning of eternity is. And as for why does the logic have this eternal character, well, once we get going with it, I think you'll find it hard to say that there was any point in time or space or anything representational within consciousness at which you could possibly ever point out and say, oh yeah, the categories, this is before, becoming existed in the world. It's just not going to happen. At every single point, there is becoming. At every single point, there is being. At every single point, there's essence. At every single point, there's going to be the concept. In some extent, to some process of realization. Continuing, Anaxagoras is celebrated as the man who first gave voice to the thought that nous thought is the principle of the world, that the essence of the world is to be defined as thought. In this he laid down the foundation for an intellectual view of the universe, the pure shape of which must be logic. Logic has nothing to do with the thought about something which stands outside by itself as the base of thought, nor does it have to do with forms that with forms meant to provide mere markings of the truth. Rather, the necessary forms of thinking and its specific determinations are the content and the ultimate truth itself. So this is something weird if you're into analytic stuff. This seems alien. The idea of the truth of truth itself just seems unintelligible. Nonetheless, this is what the logic is about. The truth as such is literally the truth of truth itself. Also, just a sort of historical comment on this. I'm not completely sure about this, but what I do know generally sort of leads me to this view, and that is that this preoccupation with nous, with thought, is probably the hallmark of Western philosophy. I don't know of any philosophy in Indian philosophy, the Indian tradition, or even Chinese tradition, which deals with this as such. There are analogs to thought, but nobody directly deals with it as thought, and considers it thought. In Indian philosophy, for example, the predominant conception is that the foundation of all things is Brahman, which is sort of, the being of beings. But Brahman is not nous, is not thought. Brahman is considered to be transcendental to reason itself. So being and thought are not one and the same. Thought is not considered to be the truth as such. Also in the Chinese tradition, you have the idea of the Tao. But the Tao also, despite it having some heavily rationalistic forms, is still not identified with nous or thought. And so, despite the fact that there are many similarities, and even speculatively, you can look at something like Taoism, Buddhism, Advaita, Vedanta, the various branches of Hinduism. None of them really have the speculative flavor which the Western tradition comes to cook up. That is something very interesting. I really don't see how other traditions achieve this particular insight. Of course, they wouldn't consider it an insight; they would consider it an error. But that would be something that is up to internal debate. Continuing, to get at least some inkling of this, one must put aside the notion that truth must be something tangible. Such tangibility, for example, is carried over even into the ideas of Plato, which are in God's thoughts, as if they were, so to speak, things that exist but in another world or region, and a world of actuality were to be found outside them, which has a substantiality distinct from those ideas and is real only because of this distinctness. The Platonic idea is nothing else than the universal, or more precisely, it is the concept of the subject matter. It is only in the concept that something has actuality, and to the extent that it is different from its concept, it ceases to be actual and is a nullity. The side of tangibility and of sensuous self-externality belongs to this null side. But on the other side, one can appeal to the representations typical of ordinary logic. For it is assumed that in definitions, for example, the determinations are not just of the knowing subject, but rather determinations of the subject matter, such that constitute its innermost essential nature. Or, in an inference drawn from given determinations to others, the assumption is that the inferred is not something external to the subject matter and alien to it, but that it belongs to it instead, that to the thought there corresponds being. Everywhere presupposed by the use of the forms of the concept, of judgment, inference, definition, division, etc., is that they are not mere forms of self-conscious thinking, but also of objective understanding. Thought is an expression which attributes the determination contained in it primarily to consciousness. But inasmuch as it is said that understanding, that reason, is in the objective world, that spirit and nature have universal laws to which their life and their changes conform, then it is conceded just as much that the determinations of thought have objective value and concrete existence. Sam Thomas, what about Arabic philosophy during the Golden Age? Considering that those build off, and I consider those to be part of the Western lineage, I'd say that they definitely have this tradition, although it seems to me that the dominant strains were ultimately mystical, in which God was beyond thought, and therefore being itself is also beyond thought. So there is no identity between thought, being, and truth itself. But I'm not sure that there isn't a strain in Arabic philosophy that also wasn't, predominantly taking in those concepts. So here we have that little comment he makes that, thought is an expression which attributes the determination contained in it primarily to consciousness. So, when we speak of thought, we're speaking of pure reason, but we're speaking of pure reason, within our minds, our heads, so to say. And while that is true, by thought we can also see that there is an immanent link to that reason which is in the world itself. That what would be, for example, the thought of physics, or the concepts of physics. One could say, well, it's like people say, well, that's just your theory, right? That's just a theory. That's just a thought, right? We don't know if those thoughts, those determinations, those models actually inhere in the world itself. The world could be completely otherwise. But clearly that's not the case. Clearly these thoughts inside our heads grasp something real and very important in the world itself. We do things with them all the time. It's not to say that just because we do things with them, it means that we necessarily have grasped the entire truth. But we have definitely grasped an actual truth, and we convey that truth intelligibly in concepts. Continuing, critical philosophy did indeed already turn metaphysics into logic, but, like the subsequent idealism, it gave to the logical determinations an essentially subjective significance out of fear of the object, as we said earlier. For that reason, these determinations remained affected by the very object that they avoided, and were left with the remains of a thing in itself, an infinite check as a beyond. But the liberation from the opposition of consciousness that science must be able to presuppose elevates the determinations of thought above this anxious, incomplete standpoint, and demands that they be considered for what they are, in and for themselves, without any such cautious restriction as the logical, the purely rational. So he says, critical philosophy did indeed already turn metaphysics into logic. I strongly believe he's referring here to what Kant calls transcendental logic, which is the use of the categories not to make syllogisms about things, but to make syllogisms of things. Therefore you put in the categories of causality, the categories of substance, the categories of experience, appearance, blah, blah, and these are the categories of what can actually be conceived to be an object at all. And therefore these logical categories become metaphysical categories, because they're not just about the ways we think about things, but it's about the ways in which things themselves can be. Substance is a logical category, but it is also a metaphysical category. It's not just a way in which we think about things, but it's a way in which things actually are. Of course, Kant says that's not how things actually are, that's just how the way things are for us, our minds. But beyond that, that's just subjective logic, subjective metaphysics, whereas Hegel says, no, things really are that way. Kant thought further of logic, that is, the aggregate of definitions and propositions that ordinarily passes for logic, as fortunate, because, as contrasted with other sciences, it was its lot to attain an early completion, since Aristotle has taken no backward step, but also none forward. The latter because to all appearances it seems to be finished and complete. If logic has not undergone change since Aristotle, and in fact, judging from the latest compendiums of logics, the usual changes mostly consist only of omissions, then surely the conclusion to be drawn is that it is all the more in need of a total reworking. For the 2,000 years of spirit's continuous labor must have procured for it a higher consciousness about its thinking and the purity of its inner essence, a comparison of the shape to which the spirit of the practical and the religious world, and of science and every form of real or idealized consciousness, has raised itself with the shape in which logic, spirit's consciousness of its own pure essence, finds itself, reveals too wide a difference that one would not be struck, even on the most superficial observation, by the disproportion and the unworthiness of the latter consciousness as contrasted with spirit's other elevations. As a matter of fact, the need for reformation of logic has long been felt. In the form and content in which it is found in the textbooks, it must be said that it has fallen into disrepute. It is still being dragged along more from a feeling than one cannot dispense with logic altogether, and the persisting traditional belief in its importance, than from any conviction that such a commonplace content and the occupation with such empty forms of let me read that then. From any conviction that such a commonplace content and the occupation with such empty forms are of any value or use. The additions of psychological, pedagogical, and even physiological material which logic was at one time given have later been almost universally recognized as disfigurations. A large part of these psychological, pedagogical, or physiological observations of these laws and rules, whether they occur in logic or anywhere else, must appear in for themselves to be quite shallow and trivial. The rule, for instance, that one should think through and personally test what one reads in books or hears by word of mouth, or if one has poor insight that one should aid the eyes with spectacles, rules which were offered for the attainment of truth in textbooks of so-called applied logic and even pompously set out in paragraphs, there must immediately strike everyone as superfluous, apart from the writer or the teacher who is in the embarrassing position of having to pad with extra material the otherwise too short and lifeless content of logic. To those examples of just like superfluous and kind of stupid applications of logic, I can say the same things, particularly and very specifically and emphatically about people who talk about dialectical logic, and this is almost entirely on the Marxists. People who will tell you, but we need, Engels came up with the laws of dialectics, the law of the change of quality into quantity and quantity into quality, the law of the negation, and the law of, contradiction, that A does not equal A. And then they try to show you, the usefulness of this by giving you some really banal, stupid examples. Like Trotsky has a work called The ABCs of the Materialist Dialectics, and he gives the example, we know, that A equals A is not true, and that the opposite, the law of contradiction is true, because, if you take an apple from the store and you take it back home, by the time you've gone home, there's been like a whole process of like material decay, a couple little atoms have scuffed off here and there, and that apple is just not identical exactly physically to the apple that you bought at the store. How anybody thinks this is useful, I do not understand. Or the example that, it's very important to understand that quality and quantity can become each other. And you give the example, look, if you cool water down, it changes quality into a solid and ice. If you heat it up, it changes quality into a gas or steam. And likewise, somehow that's supposed to help you in theorizing important things like revolutionary struggle and party organization. I don't know how. Also, the banal idea of negation, that is, for everything that comes to be, it's going to become undone because the whole world is becoming, which tells you nothing. Then, everything changes, man. I don't know how that's useful to anybody. I don't know why people think that's useful. When I see such examples, I kind of feel embarrassed. Secondhand embarrassment for people who put those things forward, because it just seems to me utterly weird and useless and sad that people don't realize that they're doing something that's pointless. All right, we still have a couple pages to go. And we have reached 7 p.m. All right, well, I'll keep reading this until it changes to another subject, and then we'll leave it off there. I don't want to leave the thought half-thought. Regarding this content, the reason why it is so spiritless has already been given above. Its determinations are accepted in their undisturbed fixity and are brought together only in external connection. Since in judgments and syllogisms the operations are mostly reduced to and found upon the quantitative aspect of the determinations, everything rests on external differentiation, on mere comparison, and becomes a completely analytical procedure and a calculus void of concept. The deduction of the so-called rules and laws of inference, especially, is no better than the manipulation of rods of unequal lengths by sorting them out in groups according to size, than a children's game of fitting together the pieces of a colored pictured puzzle. Not incorrectly, therefore, has this thinking been equated with reckoning, and reckoning again with this thinking. In mathematics, numbers have no conceptual content, no meaning outside equality or inequality, that is, outside relations which are entirely external. Neither in themselves nor in connection are they a thought. When one mechanically calculates that 3/4 multiplied by 2/3 makes 1/2, this operation contains about as much and as little thought as estimating whether in a logical figure this or that kind of syllogism applies. This is sort of an intimation of why machines can do mathematical calculation, but they can't do conceptual calculation. Okay, well, it seems to me that it's starting to pad out on something different from here. So we will leave it here on second paragraph of section 21.37 for next time. If anybody has comments or questions, go ahead and ask them. If not, we will end the stream right here. Okay, seems that nobody has anything to say. So for those of you who watched, thank you for watching. I hope you found this useful. And the further we get into this, the further the meat we'll bite into, and there will be a lot more to say about things in the coming sections. So see you next time.